The inventory listed the library, the stables, the east and west wings, the kitchen gardens, and the debts. 17,000 pounds of them. And then, at the very bottom of the third page, in handwriting so cramped it might have been an afterthought, one female dependent, status unclear, residing in the servants' quarters. Cressida Vane read that line from the doorway of what had once been her father's study. She had read it 3 times before she understood that the line was about her. The Vane family had owned Ashcroft Park for 240 years. There were portraits to prove it, stern men in dark coats, women with her grandmother's nose, a child on a pony that Cressida had always believed was her great-great-aunt Marguerite, though no one living could confirm it anymore. The house sat at the end of a gravel drive lined with copper beeches, and in autumn, the light came through those trees at an angle that made the whole world look like something out of a painting. Cressida had grown up watching that light from the upstairs window. She had assumed, in the way children assume things that seem as permanent as weather, that she would watch it for the rest of her life. Her father, the late Viscount Vane, had not shared this assumption. Or rather, he had shared it. He had simply failed to act on it in any way that mattered. The debts, it turned out, had been accumulating for the better part of a decade. Cressida had not known. She had been away, first at school, then in Bath with her mother's cousin, then, briefly in London during a season that ended when her mother died and everything else stopped for a while. By the time she returned to Ashcroft Park, her father was ill, and then he was more ill. And then, on a Tuesday in November, he was gone, and the solicitor came from Taunton with documents that told Cressida in very precise legal language that the house had been sold. Sold. 6 months before her father's death. To a man named Aldrich. No, wait. She would not think of him by his name yet. She would think of him as the new owner, because that was all he was, in the beginning. That was all he was supposed to be. The terms of the sale were not complicated. Everything went. The furniture, the silverware, the library, the horses, the kitchen gardens, the portraits, and the dependent. Status unclear. Cressida had stood in the solicitor's office and listened to all of this, with the particular stillness that comes after the body has run out of reactions. She had nodded, she had signed, where she was told to sign, and then she had walked out onto the high street in Taunton and stood in the November wind and thought very clearly, I have nowhere to go. She had 43 pounds. A trunk of clothes. The address of a cousin in Shropshire who had written to say she was welcome, in a letter so full of qualifications that Cressida had understood she was not, in fact, welcome at all. She had thought about it for 3 days. Then she had written a letter of her own, not to the cousin in Shropshire, and she had gone back to Ashcroft Park. Not as herself. That was the part she had not fully thought through, and that she could not later entirely explain to her own satisfaction. She had told herself it was practical. The new owner would need staff. The old staff, most of them, had already left or been let go. She knew the house. She knew which floorboards creaked and which chimney drew badly, and where the mice got in through the kitchen wall. She was, in the most literal sense, useful. She had not let herself think about the other reason, the reason that was harder to look at directly, that if she left, the house would become entirely someone else's, and she would become entirely nobody, and she was not ready for that yet. She signed herself into the household records as C. Whitmore, housemaid, and she put on a gray dress, and she went back through the servants' entrance she had used as a child when she was trying to avoid her governess, and she told Mrs. Pelham, the only member of the original staff who had agreed to stay on, that she had worked at a house in Dorset. Mrs. Pelham had looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Pelham had been at Ashcroft Park for 31 years. She had held Cressida when she was an infant. She had a face like old stonework, weathered and patient, and not easily surprised. Dorset, Mrs. Pelham said. Yes, And before that, bath. Another long pause. Can you carry a coal scuttle without dropping it? Yes, Cressida said, which was true. She had practiced in the barn for an hour the previous afternoon. Miss Pelham nodded once, as though filing this information in a place she might retrieve it later, and said, "The Duke arrives Thursday." He arrived on Thursday, as promised, in a carriage that was somewhat less grand than Cressida had expected, and in a coat that was somewhat more worn. She watched him from the upstairs landing window, the one with the view of the copper beaches, as he stepped out and looked up at the house with an expression she could not quite read from that distance. Not satisfaction, she thought. Something more cautious than satisfaction. His name was Benedict Hartwell, the Duke of Cornwall. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with a way of holding himself that suggested he had spent time in the military, though she did not know this yet. He had bought Ashcroft Park on behalf of someone in his solicitor's office, and then, apparently, changed his mind and decided to live in it. Or that was the version Cressida had assembled from fragments of conversation she had no business overhearing. She was very good, it turned out, at being invisible. She had grown up in this house, which meant she knew where to stand to hear what was being said in the room next door, and she knew which doors to leave slightly open, and she knew that if she carried a tray purposefully enough, people forgot to notice her. It was useful, this invisibility. She had not expected to be good at it. The Duke walked through the house on his first afternoon with a kind of quiet attention that surprised her. He did not exclaim over the proportions of the library or make remarks about the wallpaper. He asked questions, specific, practical questions about the plumbing and the roof, and whether the east wing got damp in winter. Mrs. Pelham answered them. Cressida stayed by the doorway with the tea tray and watched him notice things. He noticed the portrait. It was the last one, hung in the upstairs corridor outside the old nursery. Most of the portraits had been sold with the house or removed before the sale. She was still not entirely sure how this had happened, whether her father had sold them or whether they had simply been bundled in with everything else. But this one remained. It showed Cressida at approximately 14 years old, in a white dress that she had hated, standing beside a window in the blue sitting room. She had been painted by an itinerant artist who charged less than was fashionable. Her father had commissioned it in a moment of sentiment he almost immediately forgot about. The Duke stopped in front of it. Cressida, coming down the corridor with an armful of linens, stopped also. She turned slightly, presenting her profile, and kept walking. "Whose portrait is that?" she heard him ask Mrs. Pelham. A pause. "One of the family, Your Grace." "Which family?" Another pause, longer. "The previous family, the Vanes." She did not hear his response. She was already around the corner, her heart doing something she chose to ignore. The days settled into a shape. She rose before 6, made fires, carried water, helped in the kitchen, carried more things. Her back ached in a way it had never ached before. Her hands, which had been soft in the way of women who had never needed them for anything practical, became red and rough along the knuckles. She learned to move through the house like a part of it, one of the older, quieter parts that no one looked at directly. She also learned the Duke. He was not what she had expected. She had expected someone who would take possession of the house in the way that men of his station sometimes did, loudly, with an air of entitlement that colonized every room he entered. Instead, he was quiet. He ate simply. He spent his mornings in the library, working through papers, and his afternoons walking the grounds in the same worn coat. He was unfailingly polite to the staff in a way that was genuine rather than performative, which was different, Cressida thought, from how her father had been polite to the staff. Her father's politeness had always had an edge of distraction to it, as though the courtesy were something he was performing while thinking about something else. The Duke's courtesy, appeared to be his actual personality. This was inconvenient. It was much easier to think of him as the usurper, the interloper, the man who had bought her house if he was unpleasant. He was not unpleasant. He was thoughtful and occasionally funny, and once, on a cold morning, he had come into the kitchen himself to ask if there was coffee rather than ring for it, which had shocked Mrs. Pelham into a silence that lasted 10 minutes. She tried to remember the portrait, her father's portraits, her grandmother's, the child on the pony, his property now, the copper beeches, their light, his property, the creak of the third stair from the top, his, all of it. It helped. Somewhat. It helped less when he began to notice her. It started small. The Duke had a habit, she observed, of looking at things until he understood them. He would sit with a document he did not comprehend and turn it over until it made sense. He applied this habit to the house, to the plumbing, to the accounts, to the question of why the East Wing kitchen smelled inexplicably of vinegar. And after about 3 weeks, he began applying it to Cressida. She would not have called it obvious. But she became aware, in the way you become aware of someone standing slightly too close, that she was being paid attention to. He asked her name. She said Whitmore. He asked how long she had been in service. She said several years. He asked where she was from, and she said the West Country, which was true. And he nodded, and she left the room, and later, alone, she stood at the window of the room she slept in. A small room at the back of the house that she had sometimes used as a child when she was ill and needed to be near the kitchen. And she thought, this cannot continue. And yet it did continue because she did not leave, and she could not explain to herself why she did not leave. She told herself it was the house. It was the beaches in the morning. It was the third stair. It was knowing every moment of every day exactly where she was. She did not tell herself the other thing. His solicitor arrived in January, a thin man named Partridge, who came with a briefcase and an expression of suppressed urgency. Cressida was polishing silver in the dining room when they sat down in the library, and the door was not entirely closed. She did not mean to listen. This was not entirely true. She stood very still with the candlestick in her hand and listened. The Vane matter, Partridge said, is more complicated than we initially believed. In what way? The Duke's voice was even. The late Viscount had a daughter. We knew this. What we did not know, what was not disclosed in the original sale documents, is that he made an attempt some months before his death to arrange an entailment on her behalf. Papers shuffling. It was never properly executed. Legally, it would not hold. But there are those who might argue otherwise. Silence. Who? The Duke said. A cousin, name of Dunford. More papers. He has engaged a solicitor in London. He is claiming, on grounds I find somewhat tenuous, that the sale itself was made under duress, and that the estate should revert, not to the daughter, to him as the male heir. A longer silence. What happened to the daughter? A pause, as though Partridge were consulting a document. Unknown. She left Taunton sometime in November. No subsequent address. Cressida set down the candlestick very carefully on the cloth she had laid out for it. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. This surprised her. Find her, the Duke said. She nearly left that night. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the back room and thought about it with great precision. She could be on the morning coach to Taunton before anyone was awake. And from Taunton she could go to Bristol. And from Bristol she could go somewhere far enough away that the name Vane meant nothing to anyone. She did not go. She could not afterwards reconstruct exactly why. Perhaps it was the cold. It was a very cold January. Perhaps it was the thought of the portrait in the upstairs corridor, looking at nothing in an empty house, slowly becoming only wallpaper. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something she was not ready to name. She went back to work in the morning, and she was more careful, and she watched the Duke with the particular attention of someone who has just realized that the situation they have constructed is far more fragile than it appeared. He was, she now understood, not unintelligent. It was the sketch that gave her away, or rather, it was the sketch in combination with the portrait, and the Duke's habit of looking at things until he understood them. He had found a box of drawings in the library, the kind of miscellaneous collection that accumulates in a house over generations, watercolors of the grounds, architectural plans, maps of the estate. Among them was a sketch, done in pencil, of a young woman sitting in the orchard. Cressida had done it herself when she was 17. She had been trying to learn to draw properly and had settled, eventually, for something slightly more lopsided than she had intended. She knew it was in the box because she had seen it there, years ago, and had left it as the kind of thing that was too minor to keep but too personal to throw away. She came in to bring the Duke his morning coffee and found him holding the sketch. He looked at the sketch. He looked at her. She set the coffee down with great care and turned to leave. "Whitmore," he said. She stopped. "Come here." She turned. He was still holding the sketch, and his face had the particular expression she had come to associate with him, the thoughtful, patient attention of someone who has almost finished understanding something. "This is you," he said. It was not a question. She looked at it. It was, undeniably, her, the line of the jaw, the particular way she held her shoulders, the orchard in the background that was visible from the library window, that he had walked through himself a dozen times. "Yes," she said, because there was nothing else to say. What followed was not precisely the scene she had imagined. She had imagined dismissal, legal action, the arrival of Partridge with more papers, the arrival of Partridge with more papers. She had not imagined the Duke sitting back in his chair and looking at her with something that was closer to sorrow than to outrage. "Sit down," he said. She sat. There was a fireplace. The fire was going because she had made it herself at 6:30 that morning, and there was a particular comfort in this that she did not look at too closely. "How long," he said, "have you been here?" "Since November, and before that, I lived here. My whole life." A silence. "Your father was the Viscount Vane." "Yes, and you came back. As a housemaid, there was nowhere else." She had not planned to say this. It came out flatly, a statement of fact rather than an appeal, and she thought that was probably right. She did not want it to be an appeal. "I know the house. I thought, I wanted." She stopped. "I wasn't ready," she said finally, "to leave." The Duke looked at the fire for a long time. "The cousin," he said. "Dunford, you know about him?" "I heard Partridge." A flicker of something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, not quite dismay. "Of course you did." He looked at the sketch again. "He has no legal claim. I want you to understand that. Whatever argument his solicitor is constructing, the sale was valid." "The estate is mine," she said. "What you may not know is what he actually wants." The Duke set the sketch down on the desk, carefully, as though it were something to be returned to its owner. "He does not particularly want the estate. He wants what he believes your father left behind, in terms of social position and connection. He is, from what I can determine, the sort of man who requires other people's things in order to feel he has things of his own." Cressida thought about her cousin Dunford, whom she had met twice and disliked on both occasions. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly right. He is claiming that you have a prior right of inheritance that supersedes the sale." The Duke's voice was neutral and precise, a man working through a problem. "He is not claiming this on your behalf. He is claiming it as grounds to invalidate the sale entirely, under a theory that—" He paused. "Under a theory that is, in my solicitor's words, creative, and in yours, dishonest," he said simply. "He doesn't care about you. He cares about the estate having been improperly disposed of, because if the sale is invalid, the estate would revert to him as the male heir rather than to you." "Of course it would," Cressida said. There was a bitterness in her voice she hadn't quite contained. "It always reverts to someone else." The Duke looked at her then, directly, the way he had looked at the sketch. "Not," he said carefully, "necessarily." Mrs. Pelham, when Cressida told her that same evening in the kitchen, did not appear surprised. "I knew," she said. "She was cutting bread and did not stop. I've known since the second day." "Then why didn't you?" "Because you needed to be here," Mrs. Pelham said. "Same as always." She set down the bread knife and looked at Cressida with the patience of someone who has watched a great deal of drama from a very practical standpoint. "The Duke's a decent man." "I know," Cressida said. "That's not always the case. I know that too." Mrs. Pelham picked up the bread knife again. "He asked me about you last week, before he found the sketch." She began cutting again with the precise rhythm of someone who has cut bread 10,000 times. "I told him the staff had a great deal of respect for Whitmore, that she knew the house better than anyone." Cressida looked at her. "That was all?" "That was all he needed," Mrs. Pelham said. "He's not slow." Dunford arrived on a Friday, uninvited, with a solicitor from London and an air of righteous injury that Cressida could hear from 2 rooms away. She had been asked by the Duke very quietly the morning before to be present, not as a housemaid, as herself. She had not known precisely what to wear for this. She settled on the least worn of her dresses, a deep blue wool that had been her mother's, let out at the seams by some previous necessity. She pinned her hair properly for the first time in 2 months. She came downstairs through the main staircase rather than the servants' stairs. And she was aware that Mrs. Pelham, watching from the hall below, gave a very small nod. The solicitor from London was named Croft, and he had papers. Dunford was 40, red-faced, and spoke too loudly for the size of the room. He did not immediately recognize Cressida. He recognized her about 4 minutes into his opening statement, when she sat down across from him at the library table and looked at him with the particular expression she had inherited, without wanting it, from her grandmother. "Cressida?" he said. "Good morning, Gerald," she said. She had rehearsed the tone. She was pleased with how it came out. The Duke sat at the head of the table and said nothing. He had the steady attentiveness of someone who has already decided how a situation will end, and is simply waiting for everyone else to arrive there. Partridge, the thin solicitor, laid out the position. The sale was valid. The entailment had never been properly executed and held no legal force. The estate belonged to the Duke of Cornwall. Any claim Dunford might make on the estate was not a claim on behalf of the Vane daughter, who was present and had been consulted, and had expressed no wish to pursue litigation, but a claim on his own behalf as a male heir, which rested on the premise that the sale itself was invalid, which it was not. Dunford talked for a while. His solicitor talked for a while. Cressida watched the fire. She had made it that morning, again, because she was still technically employed here, though the nature of her employment had shifted into a shape that no one had named yet. "Miss Vane," the Duke said, at a certain point, "do you have anything to add?" She looked at Dunford. She thought about what he actually wanted: position, connection, the feeling of having claim on something that had been her family's, that would therefore make him more than he was. "No," she said. "I think everything has been said." She paused. "I would, however, like my grandmother's brooch returned, if you have it. She left it to me specifically, and I believe it came to you in some confusion about the estate inventory." Dunford's face did something complicated. "The brooch," the Duke said pleasantly, as though this were the most natural thing to discuss, "is presumably a personal effect, and therefore not subject to the property sale in any case. I'd have Partridge write to your solicitor about it, Miss Vane, and I expect it will be returned promptly." He looked at Dunford with the same quiet attention he gave to all things. "Is there anything else?" There was not, it transpired, anything else. Afterward, when Partridge and Croft and Dunford had all gone, and Mrs. Pelham had produced tea and then tactfully disappeared. The Duke and Cressida sat in the library and did not talk for a few minutes. The fire was very good. Outside, the copper beeches were bare, but there were still birds in them, and occasionally one called out and then was quiet. "You're still employed here," the Duke said finally. Cressida looked at him, as a housemaid. The position has evolved. He turned his cup in his hands, a habit she had noticed, something he did when he was working towards something. "I owe you an honest account of my situation, I think. I bought this house because I needed somewhere to be that was not London. He paused, chose a word. I had been away for a long time, the military. When I came back, everything I had known was different, and I did not know where I belonged. The house seemed like a practical solution to not belonging anywhere." "Yes." He looked at her. "I find, having been here some months, that I understand it better than I expected. The house, the grounds, why someone might not want to leave." He set his cup down. "I also find that it is a very large house for one person." A silence. "There is a portrait," he said, "in the upstairs corridor. Yes, it should stay there." He said this with the finality of someone making a small but complete decision. "It belongs there. This is, whatever the legal documents say, a house with a history, and the history does not stop with the purchase." Cressida looked at the fire. "My grandmother's brooch," she said, "will be returned." He paused. "I meant what I said to Dunford. Personal effects are personal effects." "And what am I?" she asked. She had not meant to ask it quite that directly. But it had been a long several months, and she was tired of being a dependent with status unclear. He looked at her for a long moment. The same long, precise attention he gave to things he was working to understand. "I think," he said, "that depends significantly on what you want to be." She stayed. She was aware that this required more explaining to herself than it required to anyone else. Mrs. Pelham simply moved her things from the back room to the rooms in the east wing that had belonged to her mother. And no one discussed the particulars of C. Whitmore of Dorset again. The Duke asked Cressida to help him understand the history of the estate. The maps, the records, the stories that attached themselves to certain trees and certain rooms and certain stairs. She found she had more to say about it than she had expected. He listened in the way he listened to everything, with the patient thoroughness of someone who understands that a thing cannot be properly owned until it is also known. By March, the brooch had been returned. She wore it to dinner the first time. The Duke looked at it with a smile that was small and real, and not at all like the practiced social smiles she had grown up watching men deploy. He asked her to walk with him to the beaches. It was late afternoon, and the light was doing the thing it did in early spring, low and very gold, coming through the branches at an angle that made everything look both exactly as it was and somehow more than that. She had watched this light from the upstairs window her whole childhood. She watched it now from the ground, standing beside a man who had bought the house she loved and had turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to be the kind of man she had not known she was waiting for. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said, because she did know, the way you know things in houses you have spent your whole life in, where the rooms have their own particular acoustics and nothing remains hidden for very long, he asked her. The beeches caught the light the way they always had. She said yes, and the house, which had stood for 240 years through sales and debts and inheritances and all the complicated arrangements by which one life passes into another, held them both in the late March afternoon, very still, as though it had been waiting for precisely this.